Hi guys, welcome everyone to our March guest speaker with Dr. Lamberson. So we're gonna get started in a few minutes, so feel free to say hi.
Welcome Alliance HOSA members to our March guest speaker with Dr. Lamberson. Good evening, I'm Madhu. Just to introduce myself, I am one of your sophomore council members and I am stoked to be here tonight.
Hey guys, I'm Ruchi and I'm one of your community leaders and I'm really excited to be here and have everyone meet Dr. Lamberson. So just as a reminder, we are gonna have a QR code up for attendance at the very end, so make sure to stay the entire time.
Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce our CTSO/organization to any of our new members. HOSA is a student-led healthcare organization that strives to prepare students to be the future of healthcare. Through Alliance Academy's HOSA chapter, we bring you monthly guest speakers with a wide range of specialties and from all around the globe.
Okay, so now without further ado, tonight's guest speaker is Dr. Lamberson. And on behalf of Alliance HOSA, we welcome you with wide arms. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're truly honored to have you here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So we're going to go ahead and start off our discussion, and we will have the opportunity for member questions towards the end of the event. So that means the floor is open for any questions you may have. So you can go ahead and type them in the chat. So Dr. Lamberson, why don't you begin by introducing yourself and telling our members a little bit more about your field?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Katie Lamberson, and I am currently the Assistant Dean of the College of Health Sciences and Professions at University of North Georgia. And so it's been kind of a twisty road to get me to that current position. But I started at University of North Georgia as a faculty member in the Department of Counseling, which is a master's program there to train counselors. And my specialty is in addiction. So I train addiction counselors in that, and I still do some teaching as part of my role. But I started off, I went to college and got an undergraduate degree in psychology. And after I graduated from there, I worked in a center for children, and I worked in a residential unit and I was called a behavior specialist. So I mostly did kind of helping them with daily activities. These were kids who were struggling in home, who needed a break from their home. They needed help with behavioral skills, things like that. And so in that process, I met a lot of counselors who worked with them on more emotional stuff rather than just the day-to-day activity stuff. So I decided to go back and get my master's in counseling. And when I was in my master's in counseling program, I sort of fell into addiction work. That was never my plan. It wasn't my goal, but we had to do an internship in that program. And I got placed in a site that was an addiction site. And when I graduated, there were lots of addiction jobs available because they're in less demand than some of the mental health jobs. And I also have a brother who struggles with addiction. So all of that was kind of going on at the same time. And I became pretty passionate about that work. So I worked for several years in various settings. I did intensive in-home counseling with youth and families. I worked in inpatient women's rehab. I worked in intensive outpatient programs. I did some outpatient private practice work. And while I was working as a counselor, I realized that there are a lot of gaps in the addiction world specifically, a lot of people who don't want to do addiction counseling work, a lot of people who do it because that is where the job is, but they're not passionate about it or they're not trained well in it. So I went back to school to get my doctorate so that I could train addiction counselors. And so that's what I was doing for a long time after I got my degree, my doctoral degree. And the University of North Georgia in Cumming has a Master's of Counseling program, and they started an entire track dedicated to addiction because of some of the issues in addiction in our area. So I was brought on here to create that track, develop it, recruit for it, and teach in it. So I was doing that for a long time. And then just last year, I moved into the assistant dean role, which our college is counseling, physical therapy, nursing, and health administration. So I'm kind of over all of those departments, but I do still teach. And when I do teach, I'm teaching mostly addiction related stuff, but I'm also trained in mental health counseling as well.
I know you talked about this to us earlier, but I figured the members would want to hear it. I remember you told us that this was not exactly what you wanted to do. So maybe can you tell them that story where you figured out that this was what you wanted to do?
Yeah. So I loved psych. I loved psychology when I was an undergrad, but the message was at the time, and the message was, and I was also not in Georgia, by the way. I lived in Ohio. But the message was, you can't do anything with a bachelor's in psychology. And also, it's really hard to get a PhD in psychology. So I kind of felt a little bit stuck. And so that's when I started working at that Center for Kids. And there were a bunch of counselors there who were just master's level counselors. And I thought, well, this is what I want to do. I want to sit individually with people, and I want to talk to them about what's going on with them. I want to hear them. I want to listen. I want to be there for them. I want to provide support. And so that's how I learned about counseling as an option rather than psychology. And then, throughout that program, I just kept, addiction just kept kind of getting thrown at me. And I wasn't looking for it. I fought it a little bit. But it was right at the height of my brother's addiction. He's younger than I am. He was a teenager and he was struggling in his teenage years. And I lived close by, so I saw a lot of it. And I also saw a lot of the struggles he had with treatment in terms of just not feeling heard, not getting what he needed, people not really caring that much because they were not passionate about that particular issue. And it goes so hand in hand with mental health that I don't know. I think I just finally realized, I think personally my own healing for all the stuff that I went through in my own family, it comes from feeling like I'm doing something about the problem. So I wasn't able to fix my brother. He's actually doing very well now, but I wasn't the one to fix him. But I could at least try to help somebody else. And that made me feel like what I went through had some sort of meaning and purpose.
Yeah, no, definitely that you had that emotional connection. That's kind of what draw you to this.
Yeah.
So I was kind of wondering, what sort of treatment, when you were working as a drug counselor, full time, what were some of the treatments you offered to the patients? Kind of explaining that.
So it kind of depends on the level of care that I was in. A majority of the time I was in intensive in-home, which is where I went into the family's home. And so it was more family counseling. So it's nice because sometimes when you have a client who comes into your office, there's only so much you can do when they then go back into the same environment that they've been struggling in. You're not changing the environment. You're just talking to one person. So in intensive in-home, it gives you the opportunity to provide kind of family intervention. So whether it be family counseling or even I did a lot of parenting education. A lot of the clients I had were involved with DFACS, Department of Children's Services. So I could give them a lot of parenting education. But it also, it allowed for making change in the environment and helping families see that they can't send their kid into a session with me and I fix them. They have to kind of play a role in doing things differently as well. So I did a lot of that. I'm trained in what's called motivational interviewing, which is an approach to, actually it's used a lot in various healthcare settings now. It was born in addiction counseling. Doctors use it a lot. Nurses use it a lot. In fact, even athletic coaches use it a lot nowadays. But it's kind of about helping clients find their own internal reasons or motivations for changing some behavior. So if you are struggling with like wanting to exercise more. It kind of is an approach to help somebody work through that struggle of I want to, but I don't have time, or I want to, but I don't want to. And it gives them the opportunity to work through those things and kind of come to what works best for them and getting it to come from them. Because the problem with addiction counseling is a lot of times we just say, just don't do it. And that's not sufficient. It's not going to help somebody. So I did a lot of MI, motivational interviewing. I'm trained in like cognitive behavioral therapy, family counseling. I'm trained in what's called parent-child interaction therapy, which helps parents learn how to set limits with their kids, very young kids. So like how to do timeouts appropriately, how to interact in a positive way so that the kids feel loved and supported. Those are some of the main ones.
Do you the patients you mainly see, are you mainly treat when you did them? Did you mainly treat like children, or was it like all around?
I've worked with a lot of different age groups. So I started off working with adults, and they were adults who were involved with Department of Children's Services. And I found that I was struggling with that because I was having a lot of empathy for their kids when they were my clients, and I should really have more empathy for them. So that's when I switched to working with the kids. And that was hard in its own way too. So, and I'm actually, in fact, a foster parent myself now because I felt like as a counselor, I wasn't doing enough, or I didn't feel like going into the home for 1 hour a week was enough for those kiddos. They needed a lot more. So my husband and I now are foster parents ourselves to try to help in that way. But I think I have a lot of, passion for kiddos especially, but my very favorite population is adolescents. I liked working with teenagers the most. Teenagers, but that was my brother, so that's probably why.
One of our members had a question. Did you have any troubles or struggles with your education?
So I think the biggest struggle that I've had is knowing what education exists for what I want it to do. I like school a lot. It's also part of the reason I went back for my doctorate. I've always been really good at it, and I enjoyed being a student. So for me, it was less about the actual content or, writing papers, whatever the assignments might be. And it was more about when I was getting that message of you have to get a PhD in clinical psychology, but also you're never going to get in anywhere. And also knowing that wasn't really what I wanted to do. So clinical psychologists do a lot more assessment. They don't do as much kind of one-on-one interaction with the clients. And so it took me a while to find that. And it was only through that job that I figured out that there were other avenues. So sometimes kind of knowing what degree do you need to do what you want to do can be really hard.
What is therapy the sort of the same thing as counseling?
Yeah, so therapy is kind of a catch-all term that we use in various professions. So psychiatrists can do therapy, psychiatric nurses can do therapy, social workers can do therapy, counselors can do therapy, psychologists can do therapy. But then if you use the specific word, it's kind of around professional identity. So it's a way to sort of separate myself from a social worker to say I'm counseling someone. Sometimes it's a little bit cultural, like when I was up north, the difference between a counselor and a social worker was almost nothing. It was 2 different degrees, but the jobs you were applying for were pretty much the same. Down south, there's a bigger difference, and what jobs you apply for look a lot different down here between the two.
So right now, as you are a professor and you're like the head dean, what does a day-to-day look like?
So right now, I teach 1 day a week. So I have 1 class, and our classes are 3 hours at a time, 1 day a week. So I teach on Tuesdays. The other days, I have a lot of meetings and a lot of times things that just pop up. So I deal a lot of like professional issues with students, academic integrity issues. I deal with a lot of when faculty members don't know what to do or how to handle something, they come to me. Because I'm a counselor in that role too, I often deal with a lot of mental health related things for students. So when students are struggling with their mental health, faculty members will consult with me about how to handle it or what to do for them. I'm involved in trying to create, I'm pretty involved in curriculum. So making sure that all of the programs are offering what they need to offer in an efficient way. And then we're trying to create an interprofessional curriculum too, so that we can work together a little bit better, which is more in line with what you see in the world. So any healthcare professional doesn't work in a silo. You have to be familiar with all the other providers that are out there, because you might not be doing counseling, but you might have a patient who needs counseling. So how do you work together with a counselor to know how to get them a referral, or how to work together to give them the best treatment plan? It's sort of what we're moving towards in the healthcare profession, is more interprofessional work, collaborative work. So we're trying to create a curriculum around that, and I'm in charge of that stuff.
So we have another question from one of our members. What is your favorite and least favorite?
I'll start with least favorite first. Two come to mind. One is paperwork. Most people don't go into the field of health professions to do paperwork, and it's a necessary part of it. We want to work with people, and then there's a lot of paperwork, and it's oftentimes redundant for no reason at all. So it takes up a good amount of your time. And then the other part that I think was hard is in addiction specifically is relapse rates. So there's a 97% relapse rate. And so it can often feel really frustrating. Like you're doing all this work, you're working really hard for your clients, you're invested, you want to see them succeed, and then they relapse. And it's hard not to take that personally and to feel like maybe I didn't do enough, or I could have done something different or better, and that would have helped this client. So sort of remembering that the clients have responsibility for themselves, and it's your job more to facilitate than it is to fix and help. But it's certainly disheartening. And then the flip side to that, my favorite part would be when I'm from the counseling perspective, my favorite part is the success stories, because they are rare. They mean that much more. So I have a few that I hold on to when I'm having bad days, or when a client relapses, that I remind myself of why it's worth it. And a lot of times the things that are the hardest are also the most worth it. And then from the professor standpoint, my favorite part is the students. I love training students. I love seeing them get something. I love seeing their passion for something. When it comes to addiction, I always tell them, I sort of view them as my army. There's only so much change I can make in the world of addiction counseling by myself. So if I train really good, passionate, empathetic, ethical, competent counselors, they can go out and do that work and invoke that change for me, then all the better. And it's going to spread a little bit further, a little bit quicker. So I really like watching the growth in the students and developing relationships with them.
Yeah.
There was actually a question I wanted to ask you. So, did you ever get a case where the patient was like, "I don't need help," and they were you reluctant to open up to you and make changes in their lives?
Yeah, most of my cases were like
Yeah, where they were almost forced to come to you by their loved ones or something.
Yeah, in addiction, especially, most of the time, we're working with mandated clients. So they're there because either it's the only way to get their kids back, or I worked with, in my very first job, half my clients were trying to get their kids back. The other half they had been in jail for many years for drug-related offenses. And in order to get time off their sentence, if they went to treatment, then they could get out of jail early. So they were there for that. And then when I work with kids, most of the time their parents are the ones sending them. Very rarely did I ever have a kid who said, "Hey, I really want counseling today." So most of the time I was working with people who didn't particularly want to be there.
And I remember you saying kind of earlier when we were talking that right now, if you do see any clients or patients, they're athletes.
Mhm.
What is your work with athletes?
Yeah. So when I was in my doctoral program, I'm not an athlete. I was never an athlete. But when I was in my doctoral program, I had a graduate assistantship with an organization on campus that worked with the student athletes to promote wellness.
Mhm.
And they needed somebody, essentially, they were looking for somebody who could work with the athletes when they violated the code of conduct. So in other words, they got caught drinking or using drugs.
Mhm.
And so that's how I got involved as the addiction counselor. They wanted me to meet with them in those cases. And really what they wanted me to do is they wanted me to meet with them in a group and say, don't drink or use drugs. And that felt pointless to me, honestly, with a bunch of college kids. So instead, I met with them individually,
Mhm.
learned their story and learned what was going on for them. And I was really blown away by the amount of pressure that these students were under as athletes and as students, especially because while they're called student athletes, many of them view themselves more as athlete students and the pressure that they get from various places. And a lot of times that was what was leading them to use. And so I sort of continued that work then. I'm still an affiliate faculty with that group on that campus in another state. And then at every university I've been at since, I've connected with the athletic department to offer, just basically offer my assistance in any way that they might need. So when things come up around mental health, and it's a toss up about whether they take me up on it. There are some cultures in athletics where they want to pretend like mental health isn't a thing that exists and they don't want to deal with it. And they say, we don't need that here. And then there are other programs that are like, oh my gosh, thank you. These things come up all the time and we never know what to do. So I work really closely with the athletic departments and I've done trainings for coaches on mental health. I've done counseling for students, and I've done group counseling for teams at times.
So if an athlete was to come to you after like violating the code of conduct or something, what are some things that you like look for to feel like, oh, this person's getting better and they might go back to playing on the team and whatever?
Yeah, that's a good question. My belief around addiction in general is that whatever they're addicted to, whether it's a behavior like sex or internet use, or whether it's a substance like alcohol or drugs, it's usually serving some sort of purpose for that person. And usually there's something else going on. So a lot of times it's attached to trauma. If somebody has a history of trauma, they might be more likely to develop an addiction later on. Pressure and stress can lead to it as a way to kind of alleviate those things. So I tend to focus in this, I guess, goes back to the other question about mandated clients. I try to focus less on the behavior and more on what purpose the behavior is serving. Because I think the more we focus on, like, let's just cut down what you're using or let's stop using altogether, the less effective it's going to be, because the pressure, the stress, the trauma, it's still there at the end of the day. So for me, I give them a space to work through the things that are leading them to use. And I'll know, and then naturally they have less need to use at that point, because if they're working through their trauma or they're no longer stressed, then they might not need to smoke a joint at the end of the day, or vape, I guess, is now what people do more often. And so I usually see a natural improvement just based off of that. So oftentimes I can tell if the client's opening up to me more, they're telling me those things more readily without me having to pry it out of them. And then I think naturally their performance usually improves as well, because they're feeling lighter. The things that have been kind of weighing them down are no longer bothering them. And it's easier to focus on the game or the performance.
Another question I had was, what kind of people would you recommend this profession to? Because I know earlier you said that like you have to have a strong work ethic. Are there any other qualities adding on to that?
Yeah. Most of the times when students go into our program, they'll say, I'm a really good listener. I'm always the person my friends come to when they have a problem. So that's a good one to have, to be somebody who wants to listen and who can listen. Because in these relationships, it's about listening more than anything. At times I'll share my own story about my brother. Sometimes it gives me street cred with the clients, but otherwise, they often want to know, are you in recovery yourself? Things like that. And I'm not, but because my brother is, it buys me a little bit of credibility. But I think you also have to be really willing and able to do a lot of self-reflection. So we do require our students to do a lot of introspection and understanding yourself, because there's a lot of figuring out what biases do you have, how do those biases impact the way that you interact with people, what are your values. And some of the values of the profession, of course, are genuine care for people and doing the right thing. So, sometimes part of my job is to tell people things that they don't want to hear, but they need to hear. I'm not always here to tell people what they want to hear. So I have to have uncomfortable conversations. And that kind of comes with time, but a willingness to be open to that feedback and to grow is important. So people need to be kind of willing to grow as a person in order to be in this role. I'm a really different person now than I was before I started being a counselor, because I've probably learned just as much from my clients over the years, and my students too, as a professor, than they've learned from me.
Yeah, definitely. Like it is always like changing too, so you're gonna have to change with it.
Yeah.
I was wondering, how has technology expanded your life? How was it like playing to improve?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, telehealth is a huge thing nowadays, especially after COVID, and the same thing with teaching. So I'm sure y'all are familiar with online teaching after everything we've been through in the last couple of years. But telehealth, and it's really done a lot to change in a good way. So in the counseling profession, every state has its own a set of credentials for licensure. And if you're licensed in Georgia and you're not licensed anywhere else, you can only practice in Georgia. And licensure in all 50 states is relatively new. When I was in my master's program, California still didn't have a license requirement. So they do now, but so we have been trying for years and years to have parity, where if you move to another state, you can become a counselor there without having to do a bunch of other things. And that's been really hard. But now that telehealth exists, suddenly states are on board with trying to find that parity, because now the way that it is I can see a client in Ohio or North Carolina because I'm also licensed in those two states, or Georgia. So I have to be licensed in whatever state my client lives in order to see them.
Mhm.
If we have parity, then I could see clients all over the world. And because telehealth is so huge now and a lot of clients really want that, it's more and more important for us to be able to do that. So telehealth is a big one. There's lots of apps out there too now. I know there's been a lot of research done around the use of apps for addiction, like to help track how much money you're saving by not drinking today, those kinds of things, or it provides coping skills when you're struggling in the moment. Support groups like 12-step meetings, AA, NA, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, those sorts of things are now offered online. So you can almost find a meeting anytime, anywhere if you need one. So access is a lot easier for counseling, which is really nice, but it does also add a lot of ethical components to it too. There are, if you're working from home, for example, things that clients can kind of know about you just based on your surroundings. I've got young kids and they struggle when the door is locked. So if they're banging on the door when I'm trying to do a session, those kinds of things become harder too. So pros and cons, I guess.
Okay, so if you have a patient that's like maybe from Virginia and they're like you're doing like a online session, is that part of your scope of practice even though you're not certified in Virginia?
I would have to be licensed in Virginia in order to see that person.
You wouldn't be able to treat them.
No.
Okay.
Not currently, but we are moving in that direction now, which is good.
Mhm.
So, if you are like you said you work at home, right? So how often do you like go in? Do you work at a clinic or is it all just at home? Or how often do you balance that?
I actually prefer in-person work. So we have the ability to work from home more than I typically do. So I don't see clients full time anymore. The ones I do see, I sort of leave it up to them a little bit. If they want to do telehealth or a virtual session, I'll do it. I prefer in person if I can. I just think it's easier to connect with people in person. It's a lot easier to understand nonverbals in person. Things don't get quite as lost in translation. A big part of what we do is watching the client as much as we're listening to the client. So if you've got a client who's talking about their dad, and every time they mention their dad, they fold their arms or start shaking their leg, that's a good indication that there's something up with that topic and you want to explore it more. But you can hide that stuff easier when you're on camera.
Yeah. I feel like some people prefer to do online at first, and then they like start coming in person as they connect more. It's just easier to hide behind a screen and like, yeah.
Yeah, it's a little safer up front, I think, for sure. But it's really nice to have for people who struggle with social anxiety or agoraphobia, like they don't want to leave their house.
Mhm.
They can get services in ways that they never could before. People with disabilities who can't get to sessions, like they can't drive themselves or things like that, can have them now. So it has opened up the door for us to be able to serve more people. And it depends. Some people like virtual better. Some counselors like to counsel virtually better. Some clients like to go virtually better. If I were going as a client, I would still probably prefer to go in person.
Yeah.
And as a counselor, I prefer. Same thing with teaching. I don't like teaching online either. I do most everything in person when I can.
So a lot of our members that are watching now, we're all high schools and we're looking to figure out kind of where we want to go in the field of healthcare. So what do you have any like recommendations for those that do want to pursue being a drug counselor or something?
Yeah. So you have to get in order to be a licensed counselor in the state, you have to have a master's degree. That's the terminal degree in counseling. So if you get a PhD like I have, that's just to teach and do research. So if all you ever want to do is just be a counselor, you don't have to get anything past a master's, which is different than a clinical psychologist. You would have to get a PhD in order to counsel with a clinical psychology degree. So in the most master's programs don't require a specific bachelor's degree in order to apply. A majority of our students come from a psych background, most of them, but not always. We've had students who were art majors. We've had students who were statistics majors. We've had students who are biology majors. So you really can do whatever you want in undergraduate and still then decide to get a master's degree. So once you get to the point of wanting the master's or the counseling degree, things to keep in mind would be, I would look for a program that is accredited. And for counseling, the accrediting body is CACREP, CACREP. Most state licensure boards nowadays require that you've graduated from a CACREP program in order to get a license in the state. So they've gotten pretty strict about the education. So that's the first thing I would look for. If you want to do addiction specific, every counseling program, regardless of specialty, is going to require you to take one course in addiction, because even if you're not working in a specifically addiction setting, you will encounter it. Absolutely. It's everywhere. So everyone's required to take it. So in our program, for example, the course I'm teaching right now, we have 3 tracks. We have an addiction track, we have a clinical mental health track, and we have a college counseling and student affairs track. So people can specialize in one of those 3 areas, but all 3 tracks have to take the class I'm teaching right now. Because it's just kind of the basic addiction requirement for anybody, so that you have some knowledge and understanding. So if you have a certain specialty you're looking for, that would be the other thing I would look into, is does the program offer that? And then the last thing I would probably look at would be the faculty members. If you're interested in something specifically, like let's say you're interested in play therapy, you might want to look and make sure somebody on faculty has an expertise in play therapy. Or maybe you're interested in working with veterans, so you want to see if there's a faculty member who has experience or interest working with veterans. Most programs are going to require an interview these days, and you'll usually meet the faculty, and it's probably a toss-up about whether they're virtual or in person. Ours are in person. And so I would say the most important thing then would be the feel at that interview. Most of the students who come to our program will say I made my decision to come here after the interview because it felt right. I liked the culture here, faculty, all kind of seem to gel with me and what I need. I like their personalities, those kinds of things. And some programs are very small and some are very big. Ours is relatively small. We only accept 20 to 30 students every year, and it's a 3-year program. The program I was at before, they took like 90 students a year. So do you want to be a small fish in a big pond or a big fish in a small pond? Kind of some of that is knowing yourself.
With your PhD, have you like partook in any research projects like concerning drug therapy?
Yeah. So most of my research surrounds family dynamics and addiction. So I've looked at how certain parenting styles impact adolescent addiction, and specifically looking at how certain parenting styles impact sort of someone's self-concept, and that self-concept then is what leads to the addiction. So things like self-esteem. For example, if we are too helicoptery, I've never used that term in my research, but if we're helicopter parents, are we sending the message that we don't believe in our kids? We feel like we have to do it for them. And then does that impact their self-esteem? And then do they use as a way to cope with the low self-esteem? Those sorts of things.
So I had a question about like how you balance your job and your personal life. Is this a very like demanding job where you have to work a lot and like you can't have any like little to no free time, or is it something where you can do what you love but also like have time to yourself, like hobbies wise?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that's a big part of my life right now. I mentioned I'm a foster parent. I have 3 young kiddos at home. So I have a 4.5-year-old, 2.5-year-old, and a 9-month-old. And so it's really important to me to be able to still have time with my family. Typically, I'm pretty boundaried around what time I do things. Rarely, I will agree to do things at 5:30 at night and tell my husband he has to figure it out with the kids. But I do try to protect the evening time to be with them, and it's pretty doable. So I think it kind of depends on the setting. When you're a full-time counselor, if you're working in nonprofit agency work, the nice thing about that is you're typically paid a salary. So it doesn't matter if you see a client or not, you get paid for 40 hours a week. And when I was working in nonprofit work, I worked 4 10-hour days, and that was when I was single and didn't have any kids. So working from 9 to 7 wasn't a big deal. And then I got an extra day on my weekend, and that to me was worth it, to work a couple extra hours in one day to have a whole extra day off. But you could structure it to where you're working pretty typical 9 to 5. And then, like I said, if you've got a client who no-shows you at 11 or cancels at 11, you get paid regardless. Mm-hmm. If you work in private practice, you can set your own schedule. So if you want to work 40 hours, you can say, on Monday, I work 9 to 5. On Tuesday, I work 12 to 8. On Wednesday, I work 9 to 5. On Thursday, you can set those hours yourself. But the way then that would work is if you have a client during one of those hours, if you have a client scheduled at 11 to 12, if they show up, you get paid. And if they don't, you don't. And so I know a lot of people who do private practice work because of the flexibility of setting their own hours. And they might even work like on a Saturday morning, for example, so that they can be home during the week while their partner's at work, and then their partner's home with the kids on Saturday while they're at work or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then in my job, it's very flexible in terms of, if I'm teaching, I have a certain place I have to be at a certain time. But outside of that, I set my meetings whenever they work for me and the rest of the people. And then I can be pretty protective of, like, after 5 o'clock, I'm home with my kids until bedtime. And then I'm with my husband or get some time to myself until whatever. And then I get up and do it the next morning. So, kind of the higher up you are, the more flexibility you have. So the PhD kind of helps me in that regard, but yeah.
I remember earlier we were talking about like most of the patients you see don't really want to be there. They're not really like wanting to come seek therapy. So, what are some things that you do to deal with kind of still getting them the help that they need?
Well, I think at first it's about building a relationship with them. So initially, I try not to make it about the reason that they're there, which is usually the thing they don't want to talk about. Like, I don't have a problem with alcohol. I don't need to be here. So I'm not going to talk to them about alcohol, because if they don't have a problem and I just keep talking to them about this thing that they don't think they have a problem with, I'm never going to be able to develop a relationship with them. So I spend more time just trying to get to know them and build a relationship with them. Part of that motivational interviewing that I was talking about before is about kind of finding, almost like finding your in. So if somebody is coming in and saying, well, I'm here because my wife said I had to be here because she thinks I have a problem with alcohol, but I really don't have a problem with alcohol. What I hear in that is, you really care about your wife. You love your wife and you care about your relationship with your wife. So let's talk about that. And hopefully throughout talking about this person that they care about, they'll realize that what they're doing, the alcohol, is impacting their relationship with that person that they care about. And then is that enough? Is that enough to cut down what they're doing or to change what they're doing? And that usually helps, because it helps people feel like you're talking about the things that matter to them. And I know that inadvertently, I'm still talking about the thing that they don't think they need to talk about because they're related.
What are some of your most memorable cases that you've dealt with?
Oh, goodness. So the one that stands out to me the most was one of my very first cases when I first started outside of my master's program. And the reason for that is because I spent probably about 20 hours a week with this one person. She was my individual client. She was like 19 years old, had a long history of trauma. She was there because she had her kids taken away and she wanted to get them back. They were in foster care. She had a history of intimate partner violence with one of the child's father, who was currently in jail. She had, so she was part of our intensive outpatient program. So she came 3 times a week for 3 hours at a time for a group, and I ran that group. And then she also came twice a week for individual, and I was her individual counselor. And then she also did supervised visits with her kids, and I was the one who supervised those visits with her kids. So I spent a ton of time with this particular individual. And so that's a lot of the reason why she stands out to me. But I think some of it too is just that she was so young and she had been through so much. And if you looked only at the reason why she was in services, it would be hard to have a lot of empathy for her. Some of the drugs she was using, the amount that she was using, and the neglect that her kids were experiencing as a result of what she was using, make it really hard to feel for her at all. But when you really know her story and you hear about the trauma she experienced as a kid, she had given, there were 2 kids that she had that were in foster care. She had given 2 kids up for adoption also. And she experienced a lot of guilt and sadness around that. Her sense of self-worth was just really small because of some of the things in her past around abusive physical and mental abuse from parents, from partners, from friends. And so I think she was the first case that really made me realize there's more to this than the addiction, and that people are struggling with addiction have so much sadness in their life and deserve to be heard. Because if I didn't hear those things and I just heard she was using X amount and her kids didn't have any food, it would be really easy to kind of write her off and just say, oh, her kids are better off somewhere else. And she was, she did everything she needed to do, but she also struggled a lot along the way. So I saw a lot of ups and downs with her too.
After looking back on your career, you were in so many different fields and done so many different things. Or is there anything that if you could go back, you would change about your
Yeah, I have learned now how much I didn't know when I was full-time counselor, especially working with kids. So at one point I had a kid that was as young as 3,
Mhm.
and I was not trained to work with a 3-year-old in counseling. So trying to sit with a 3-year-old and talk to them the way you would talk to a 15-year-old, it's not going to work.
Mhm.
But I didn't know any better. So I think I would have sought out specific trainings in things, or maybe been a better advocate for myself and said, no, I'm not qualified to see this client because I don't have the training that I need in order to see them. I have developed a much stronger advocacy identity over the years. Once again, the PhD helps with that. It's easier for me to feel like I can advocate when I have those letters behind my name. But I'm very introverted and I can be pretty shy too. And so it was hard for me in those early years to advocate for me and for my clients when there were things that didn't feel right, or when things that felt maybe unethical. And so I wish that I had developed that identity earlier, so I could have done those things earlier.
Yes, so just if you want to give like a piece of advice to your younger self, what would
Advice to my younger self, or advice to the people here?
advice to your younger self? Like,
To my younger self. Maybe to just to trust my gut more, to know that it's there for a reason, and that it's something worth trusting, and that I maybe wasn't a counselor I hadn't been a counselor for 10 years, but I know the client in front of me better than anybody else does. And so that's worth something.
I know you said apart from this you wanted to do another thing. But like even before that, like even before you were in school and everything, since you were like little, what did you want to do? And how did that like change over the years?
I was going to be a lawyer for
Mhm.
most of the time. And in fact, my family has spent the better part of my life telling me what a terrible educator I would be. And when I reveal that to my students now, they're like, let me talk to them. You're the best. I can't believe they would say that. So education was never on my radar because I always believed I would be bad at it. But I wanted to be a lawyer because, I guess, 2 reasons. One, I like to argue. I'm pretty good at getting my way because I'm not using opinion. I can take a lot of information and give it back and have it make sense. And it's hard to poke holes in my rationale sometimes. But also, I have a very strong personality of like what's right and fair. And so I thought that would be a good fit for me for that reason. What's not a good fit for me was that I am not particularly ruthless. Like, I'm not willing to hurt anybody to get what I want or to get my needs met. I know when to step back. I put other people first all the time. And so I think what changed, so I went into psychology undergraduate, still with the plan of going to law school afterwards, because I took a psych class in high school that I really enjoyed. I enjoy kind of figuring out the why behind people's behavior. It's intriguing to me to try to understand what makes people tick, especially in for things that I don't understand. So for me, I experienced tons of stress. I have a lot of anxiety at times, and it would absolutely never occur to me to pick up a drug or alcohol to cope with those things. And so I'm very interested in the people who that is what occurs to them, because it doesn't make sense for me. So I want to understand the things I don't personally understand. So that was why I got into psychology undergraduate. And then at one point during my undergraduate, I was working at a grocery store, and I had an experience with a older person who needed help taking their groceries out to their car. And I took the groceries out to their car, and he just was telling me a lot of his story. And it was just clear, I think, that he was lonely and wanted someone to keep talking to. And so I ended up standing at his car for a very long time, listening to this man, and I enjoyed it a lot. And it was, I think, after that experience that I was like, I know I really like this psychology stuff, but I also just really like listening to people and being there for people and letting them share their stories. And I don't even have to say a whole lot. I just can be there for them. And sometimes that's all they need. And so that was when I decided that maybe using the psych degree in a different way would be a better fit for me.
So you were initially going to use the psych degree to help you like in the laws.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like forensic kind of psych.
Yeah.
I would be actually one of my supervisors once told me, like, you would be a very good detective because I don't miss anything. I'm very detail oriented. I have a photographic memory. So, and I think like a criminal, but I'm terrified of getting into trouble. So I don't do anything criminal.
Yeah.
So I would be a good person to get into their heads, I think.
I think that like being detail oriented also kind of helps with the counseling aspect. You can actually notice like little tics that your patients may have and everything.
Absolutely. Yeah, to notice it. And I remember things pretty well. So when clients say things that don't align with something they've said maybe 3 weeks ago, I'm pretty able to remember that. And I'm not afraid to bring it back in. I tend to be pretty confrontational as a counselor, partly because I seem it more down here because I'm from the north, and so down here people are a lot nicer than I'm used to, but also just partly because it comes from a genuine place of care. I'm saying this because I care and I want you to grow, not because I'm trying to catch you in something or because I'm trying to hurt your feelings.
Yeah. So when you were kind of working as a counselor, were there any like specific occupations you worked alongside with, or did you like refer them to any other occupations, any other professionals after you worked with them?
Yeah. So once again, it depends on the setting a little bit. When I worked inpatient, I worked a lot more with nurses and doctors. So they always have, especially for alcohol and opiates, they always have to have medical professionals on staff because detoxing from those two substances is very dangerous. And so they often have to prescribe medication in order to help with this process. So I had to work very closely with medical providers in inpatient. I also psychiatrists, because most of the clients I've seen over the years have been prescribed some kind of psychiatric medication. So clients are even just on like Prozac for anxiety or something. And so I have to be able to work with them because clients struggle sometimes to advocate for themselves if they feel like their medication isn't working. When you meet with a psychiatrist for 5 minutes once every 3 months, it's a lot different of a relationship than when you meet for an hour with the same person every week. So sometimes they're more comfortable telling their counselor when a medication's not working or if it's making them feel kind of weird. And so being able to communicate with their medical provider to help advocate for them. So I've done a lot of that. When I worked with kids, I worked with a lot of school professionals. So whether it's the school counselor or teachers or the principal when they were having school related issues. And then social workers, I work a lot with, especially with the cases that are involved with DFACS. So I have to work with their social workers to see. Typically, counseling is just one piece of their plan in order to get their kids back. They have to do other things like they have to get a job and hold a job. They have to have stable housing. So sometimes I have to provide status updates. I have had to testify in court multiple times about progress of a client. Those are typically around the cases involving DFACS. So they'll call me to ask about a client's progress or just towards getting their kids back and those sorts of things. And then I have worked a little bit with physical therapists and occupational therapists too, because I have worked with clients who are developmentally behind. So I have had some clients who are on the autism spectrum or who struggle with developmental delays. And when I work with those clients, they often are involved in occupational therapy and physical therapy.
Are you like happy with where you are, or do you see yourself like taking more training and advancing your career even more, or do you feel like you're like at a relatively stable place where you want to be for the rest of your career?
I would never have if you had asked me, I would never have told you that I was going to be a dean. I was never going to be an educator because I was going to be bad at that. So I never would have expected to be at a university at all, let alone to be in the leadership role that I'm in. So I struggle to say yes or no because I have kind of ended up places. But in terms of the counseling side of things, there's always stuff to learn, and I continue to go to conferences, to attend trainings specifically around addiction to make sure that I'm staying up to date with things. The drugs that are popular, the ways people are using drugs, it changes constantly and it's hard to keep up with. So in order to train good counselors, if I'm training people to work with adolescents nowadays, I'm not necessarily talking about joints anymore. I'm talking about vapes. So I have to kind of stay up with those things. But I don't have necessarily any intention of moving out of the addiction world. It's a small world. There's not enough people doing it. I really am so passionate about finding more people who want to do it, people who are interested in doing it, people who can do it. It takes a lot of you take a lot of hits with the relapse. So, people who can handle that and who can have the empathy for the clients anyway, that sort of thing. So, and I don't like the way this sounds, but I know that I'm good at it. And so I would hate to walk away from it when there are not a lot of people who are good at it. And I feel like the clients would be the ones to suffer if I did that.
I know, I'm sure it can be definitely really difficult, but what is your first step when you find out that
It depends on the referral source, honestly. So if they're mandated by something, the first step is probably to tell that person. So if it's DFACS, for example, I would have to report that. If it's a client who's there kind of on their own, or if they're there because like a spouse told them, I have confidentiality and I do not have to share that with the spouse necessarily. So I think for me, the first step would be to evaluate like what was happening that led to that. Typically, it's not just one thing. It's a lot of things that have been kind of piling up. So reevaluating, like high risk situations. If there are certain people that might be triggering, like, my brother, he's doing really well, but there's this one kid that was his using buddy that if he were to get back in touch with that person, that would concern me. So sometimes people can be triggers. Too much stress at work or like not setting boundaries. So I would kind of want to understand what happened. And then I would probably reevaluate the level of care first. So if they're just doing sessions once a week, is that enough? Do they need more? Do they need to go back to like a inpatient treatment where they're there for 30 days and they live there? Those would probably be the first things I would do.
And when you were practicing, was the environment you worked in a hospital setting or like a
So different ones. So the first, I worked at an inpatient rehab that was more like a hospital setting. And then I've worked in mostly outpatient agencies that are nonprofits. So the clients kind of live their life, have their jobs, and then they come in either for groups or individual, depending on what their treatment plan requires. And then I have done some private practice, which is tends to be higher SES, more self-pay type of people versus the nonprofits, which you often see clients who are either can't pay at all or they're on Medicaid, low SES. A lot of the houses, when I did in-home, a lot of the homes that I went into were below the poverty line type of clients.
I don't know if this was asked before, but at our age, we're like starting to look for internships and things. And if our members were interested in this certain field, do you know any good clinics or like major hospitals that has a good intern program?
Yeah, I'm not sure necessarily about at the high school level because most of the internships I deal with are at the master's level, but I think there are lots of community groups. I mean, you can get involved with the Forsyth Council. Drug Awareness Council. That's how y'all got in touch with me. And that group is open to anybody who's interested, and they do a lot of work. So they're putting on a walk for recovery on April 23rd of this year. So you could help organize that walk. It's great volunteer experience. And those kinds of things are going to look really good on your resume when you're applying to the master's program. So if you have any type of relevant experience at the high school level, that's going to look really good. Northside Hospital has a very good program. Most of their mental health stuff is in their Atlanta facilities versus the Northside for Side. So it's a little bit further out. Sometimes there are places that are looking for maybe interns who can help more with like marketing and social media management. So those would be good places to get involved too. You're not going to be able to necessarily see clients, but you're going to learn a lot about the types of clients in mental health just from being there. So Therapeutic and Recovery Network's another one in Forsyth that does that sometimes. You can reach out to private practices in the area. Beyond Today Counseling is a private practice in the area, and just find out if they have internship programs. Another great one that is not super local, it's in Gainesville, would be Rape Response. They have a really good intern program as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me all those options.
Yep.
So once again, thank you so much for coming on and giving us your time. It was a great experience. I learned a lot.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so to close out our event, we'd like to thank all of you guys for joining this conversation and making it interactive. So we'll go ahead and leave the QR code up for attendance for another 30 seconds, and then this video will be posted on our YouTube channel. So thank you guys so much, and have a great day.